There comes a moment when you have to stop asking whether your life feels comfortable and start asking a more dangerous question. Is it going anywhere that actually matters? Because wasting your life does not always look dramatic. It does not always look like failure, chaos, or collapse. Sometimes it looks organized, productive, distracted, entertained. You wake up, do what you have to do, tell yourself you will get serious soon, and then another week disappears. Then another month. Then another year. And the frightening part is not that life became hard. It is that life kept moving while you were only half inside it. The Stoics warned about this with unusual honesty. Marcus Aurelius kept reminding himself that time is being taken every day. Seneca said it even more clearly. Life is not short, but we make it so by wasting much of it. That is why this episode is not here to comfort you. It is here to interrupt the drift, to expose the habits, excuses, delays, and quiet forms of self-betrayal that slowly turn a human life into unused potential. Because the truth is simple. Your life is already being shaped, even on the days when you think nothing is happening. So take a breath. Stay with me until the end. And if this kind of content speaks to you, subscribe to the channel. And now, let's begin with the first brutal truth. The first truth: your life is being spent even when you feel nothing. One of the most dangerous illusions you can live under is the idea that life only counts when something intense is happening. You feel that a year matters when there is visible success, visible pain, a major loss, a breakthrough, a dramatic change, a big decision, a moment you know you will remember. But Stoicism asks you to look at time much more honestly than that. It asks you to understand that your life is not only being spent during the loud seasons. It is also being spent during the quiet ones, during the numb mornings, during the distracted afternoons, during the evenings you tell yourself you are too tired to think, during the weeks that feel forgettable, during the strange emotional flatness where nothing seems urgent, nothing seems beautiful, and nothing seems serious enough to force you to wake up. Time is still moving then. Your life is still being exchanged then. That is the brutal part. Existence does not pause simply because you have become emotionally disconnected from it. And this is why numbness can be more dangerous than pain. Pain at least gets your attention. Pain interrupts you. Pain makes you ask questions. Pain forces reflection. But emotional dullness can let years pass in a strangely silent way. You keep functioning. You keep showing up just enough. You do what needs to be done on the surface, and from the outside, everything can still look normal. That is what makes it so deceptive. Nothing appears broken enough to demand change. Yet something much deeper is being lost. Your aliveness, your intentionality, your sense that this day matters. Seneca warned that we do not receive a short life, but often make it short by wasting much of it. He was not speaking only about obvious self-destruction. He was speaking about unconscious living, about the slow leak of existence through carelessness, through delay, through not fully inhabiting your own days. You can feel this truth in a very ordinary moment. You wake up, reach for the phone, scroll for a while, move through the day half awake, do a little, avoid a little, postpone a few necessary thoughts, seek a few small comforts, and promise yourself that when your mood improves, you will become the person you keep imagining. Nothing catastrophic happened, no disaster, no collapse, but a piece of life was spent. A real peace, a peace that will never return in any form. Marcus Aurelius kept bringing himself back to this reality, not to make himself anxious, but to make himself honest. He understood that death is not what makes life tragic by itself. What makes life tragic is being given a day and not seeing it clearly while you have it. Sometimes the mind protects itself by becoming emotionally distant from its own condition. That is why you may not feel urgency, even when your habits are quietly eroding your future. You may not feel fear, even when you are wasting what matters. You may not feel grief, even when your attention is fragmented, your body is undisciplined, your inner world is neglected, and your purpose has gone foggy. But Stoic wisdom does not measure truth by your mood. It measures truth by reality. Reality says the day is being used. Reality says repetition is shaping identity. Reality says what you do when you feel nothing still becomes part of your character. In fact, those moments may reveal character more clearly than the dramatic ones, because anyone can make promises in a burst of inspiration. The real question is who you become on the ordinary day, the flat day, the day with no applause, no crisis, no motivation, no emotional music playing in the background. That is where a life is either built or quietly abandoned. Epictetus would say that your task is not to control how you feel at every moment, but to govern how you live. That distinction matters, because if you wait to feel deeply inspired before acting with seriousness, you hand your future over to emotion. And emotion is unreliable. Some days it gives you fire, some days it gives you fog. If you build your life around emotional weather, then your direction will always be unstable. But if you build it around principle, then even a dull day becomes useful. Even a heavy day becomes meaningful. Even a numb day becomes material for discipline. You may not feel like much is happening, yet something important is still taking place. You're either strengthening the part of you that lives on purpose, or you're strengthening the part that drifts. And this is where the first brutal truth becomes liberating instead of merely harsh. Once you understand that life is being spent, even when you feel nothing, you stop asking your emotions for permission. You stop saying, "I'll begin when I feel clear," or "I'll change when I feel ready," or "I'll become serious when life forces me to." No. You begin because the day is already being taken. You change because delay has a cost. You become serious because whether you direct your life or not, it is still being shaped. The clock does not care whether you are inspired. Time keeps moving with complete indifference. The Stoic response is not panic. It is responsibility. It is the quiet decision to stop bleeding life through unconscious habits. So when you notice that dead feeling, that inner flatness, that sense that days are blending together, do not treat it as a harmless phase. Treat it as a warning, not because you are broken, but because you are still alive. And that means the day still carries weight. Sit with that for a moment. This hour is part of your life. This morning is part of your life. This tired season is part of your life. It all counts. And once you really accept that, you stop living as if the meaningful part begins later. You understand that later is being created now, in your routines, in your attention, in your standards, in the way you choose to spend a day that does not feel dramatic enough to remember. That is the first brutal truth. Your life is being spent even when you feel nothing. And the moment you truly accept it, you stop waiting for life to begin and start meeting it as it is, while it is still here. The second truth. Comfort can destroy you more gently than pain. Pain has a way of forcing honesty. When life hurts badly enough, you pay attention. You stop pretending. You stop drifting through the day half awake. Pain interrupts the illusion that everything is fine. It exposes weakness, broken patterns, false attachments, and neglected truths with a sharpness that is difficult to ignore. That is why painful seasons, as much as nobody wants them, often become turning points. They shake a person out of denial. They demand adaptation. They force growth, or at least force confrontation. But comfort works differently. Comfort rarely attacks you. It rarely alarms you. It rarely makes a scene. It simply softens your urgency, lowers your standards, and slowly convinces you that there is no reason to change yet. And that is what makes it dangerous. Pain can wound you, yes, but comfort can keep you asleep. This is one of the most brutal Stoic truths, because comfort does not usually feel like an enemy. It feels deserved. It feels harmless. It feels like relief. You tell yourself you need a break, and often you do. You tell yourself you have time, and maybe it seems true. You tell yourself you are not doing that badly, that things are manageable, that you will become more disciplined when the timing is better, when the pressure rises, when the signal becomes clearer. But what if the signal has already come, and you have simply learned to ignore it because your life is just comfortable enough to tolerate? That is where many lives quietly weaken. Not in catastrophe, but in tolerable mediocrity. Not in open suffering, but in acceptable stagnation. A person in pain often has no choice but to change something. A person wrapped in comfort can postpone truth almost indefinitely. That is why comfort can be more destructive than hardship. Hardship can refine you. Comfort can dissolve you. Hardship can reveal your strength. Comfort can make you forget that you were meant to develop any. Hardship puts pressure on character. Comfort tempts character to go soft. And softness does not announce its danger at the beginning. It arrives politely. It says, "Not today." It says, "Later will be better." It says, "You have earned indulgence." It says, "One more distraction is not a problem. One more delay is understandable. One more compromise does not matter." Then suddenly you look at your life and realize the edge is gone, the seriousness is gone, the fire that once made you want to build something meaningful has been dulled by too much ease and too little resistance. The Stoics understood this deeply. They did not worship suffering for its own sake, but they distrusted comfort when it made the soul passive. Seneca warned against becoming dependent on luxury because dependence weakens freedom. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself again and again not to be carried away by pleasure, softness, or the habits of indulgence that make the mind less capable of meeting reality as it is. They knew that the greatest threat is not always what crushes you. Sometimes it is what pacifies you. Sometimes the real danger is not that life becomes unbearable, but that it becomes bearable enough for you to stop demanding greatness from yourself. You can see this in ordinary modern life very clearly. Nothing feels truly urgent because there is always a small comfort available. You feel uneasy, so you distract yourself. You feel mentally tired, so you numb yourself. You feel the weight of your own wasted potential for a moment, and before that discomfort turns into action, you escape into entertainment, food, scrolling, fantasy, noise, or endless low-level stimulation. The problem is not that comfort exists. The problem is that comfort becomes your default response to any internal friction. Then you never stay with the tension long enough to let it teach you something. You never sit in the dissatisfaction long enough to let it sharpen your standards. You never endure the emptiness long enough to hear what your life is trying to tell you. Real growth often begins in the moment you do not run from discomfort. Not dramatic suffering, but the clean, necessary discomfort of facing yourself honestly. The discomfort of waking up earlier when the bed is warm. The discomfort of silence when your mind wants noise. The discomfort of saying no to what weakens you, even though part of you still wants it. The discomfort of building slowly without immediate reward. The discomfort of boredom, discipline, restraint, solitude, and repetition. These are not punishments, they are training, they are the price of depth. They are often the exact experiences comfort teaches you to avoid, and when you avoid them long enough, you do not merely stay the same, you become smaller than you were meant to be. Epictetus would likely say that the issue is not whether something feels pleasant or painful, but whether it strengthens or enslaves you. That is the real question. Does your comfort serve recovery, clarity, and strength? Or does it become a hiding place from responsibility? Does it restore you so you can return to your mission? Or does it gradually replace your mission altogether? There is a difference between rest and surrender. There is a difference between peace and passivity. There is a difference between enjoying life and anesthetizing yourself from it. A wise person learns to detect that difference early, because once the soul becomes too attached to ease, it begins to resist all forms of necessary effort. This is why voluntary discomfort became such an important Stoic practice. Not because pain is holy, but because comfort is seductive. A cold shower, a hard workout, a period of silence, a simple meal, a day without excess. These things are not random rituals. They are reminders. They remind you that you can endure more than your comfort-seeking mind tells you. They remind you that your peace does not need to depend on constant pleasure. They remind you that strength is preserved by touching difficulty on purpose before life imposes it on you without permission. The person who never trains discomfort becomes fragile. The person who meets some hardship willingly becomes harder to shake. And maybe that is the deeper truth here. Comfort destroys gently because it rarely feels like destruction while it is happening. It feels like ease. It feels like harmless delay. It feels like a small reward. It feels like mercy toward yourself. But if it repeatedly pulls you away from discipline, from truth, from action, from courage, from inner sharpness, then it is not mercy. It is erosion, slow erosion, polite erosion, pleasant erosion. And many lives are lost that way, not through dramatic failure, but through years of choosing what feels easiest over what builds strength. So the question is not whether your life is painful enough to change. The question is whether you are awake enough to see that comfort may already be costing you more than pain ever did. Because pain can wake you up once. Comfort can keep you asleep for 10 years. And once you really see that, you stop treating ease as proof that you are safe. You begin measuring your life by a harder standard, not by what soothes you in the moment, but by what strengthens you in the long run. That is when comfort loses its spell. That is when discipline becomes an act of self-respect. And that is when rebuilding truly begins. The third truth: busyness is often disguised avoidance. One of the easiest ways to waste your life is to stay in motion so constantly that you never have to face whether that motion means anything. This is why busyness can be so deceptive. It gives you the emotional sensation of effort without always giving you the reality of progress. It lets you feel occupied, needed, stretched, and active. And because of that, it can protect your ego from harder questions. You tell yourself you are doing a lot. You tell yourself you are tired, therefore you must be moving in the right direction. You tell yourself that a full day must be a meaningful day. But Stoicism asks for a more uncomfortable form of honesty. It asks you to stop measuring your life by movement alone and start measuring it by alignment. Busy is not the same as purposeful. Full is not the same as meaningful. Motion is not the same as direction. This truth is brutal because busyness is socially rewarded. A distracted life can still look admirable from the outside. You answer messages, handle obligations, jump between tasks, solve small problems, stay available, remain connected, keep the machine running, and at the end of the day you feel drained enough to believe you have earned the right not to examine anything more deeply. But exhaustion is not proof of depth. A person can be tired for years and still be avoiding the central work of his life. In fact, that is often exactly what busyness allows. It gives you endless minor duties, so you never have to confront the major truth. You remain occupied enough to feel responsible, yet never quiet enough to ask whether your current way of living is building the future you actually want. And that is where avoidance becomes subtle. Avoidance is not always laziness. Sometimes it is overactivity. Sometimes it is constant engagement with everything except what matters most. You clean, organize, reply, plan, adjust, research, prepare, multitask, and keep telling yourself that once things settle down, then you will begin the real work. But things rarely settle down on their own. Life keeps generating demands. The world will always offer you smaller fires to put out. There will always be emails, notifications, errands, conversations, requests, and low-level obligations ready to consume your day. So if you do not consciously protect the deeper work, busyness will gladly devour it. Not because life is evil, but because what is urgent almost always speaks louder than what is essential. Marcus Aurelius understood this struggle better than many people realize. He was not sitting outside history in silence. He was surrounded by war, politics, duty, pressure, and constant demands on his time. Yet he kept returning to the same question: what is necessary now? Not what is noisy, not what is flattering, not what creates the appearance of importance. What is actually necessary? That is a Stoic question, and it cuts through confusion with unusual force. Because once you begin asking it sincerely, you start noticing how much of your day is spent reacting rather than choosing. You start seeing that many of your activities are not expressions of purpose, but escapes from it. You begin to realize that being needed by many small things can become a convenient excuse for neglecting one great thing. There is also an emotional comfort hidden inside busyness. When you are always occupied, you do not have to sit still long enough to hear your own dissatisfaction clearly. Silence becomes dangerous because silence reveals. In stillness, you may have to admit that your work lacks meaning, that your habits are fragmented, that your standards have slipped, that your attention is scattered, that your inner life is hungry, that your relationships are thin, or that the person you are becoming is not the person you promised yourself you would become. Busyness protects you from that encounter. It fills the mental space where truth might otherwise enter. That is why some people fear an empty afternoon more than a crowded week. An empty afternoon may force them to meet themselves without distraction. Seneca warned repeatedly that people protect their money more carefully than their time, even though time is the one possession that can never be recovered once lost. But in modern life, busyness makes time loss feel respectable. That is the trap. You are not wasting time in a way that looks shameful. You are wasting it in a way that looks productive. You are active, reachable, responsible, involved. Yet inside all that activity, the soul may still be drifting. Years can pass like this. You become skilled at managing a crowded life while remaining a stranger to your deeper purpose. And eventually the pain appears. Not because you did nothing, but because you did too much of what did not matter enough. This is why Stoic discipline is not merely about working harder. It is about refusing fragmentation. It is about deciding that your life will not be consumed by whatever shouts the loudest. Epictetus would say that if you do not choose your governing principles, the world will choose them for you. Busyness is one of the main ways that happens. External demands start shaping your attention. Other people's urgency becomes your structure. Randomness becomes routine. Your nervous system becomes trained to live in reaction, and a reactive life almost always feels busy. But it rarely feels deeply owned. You are moving, yes, but you are not really steering. And that is the deeper wound of a busy but misdirected life. It disconnects effort from meaning. You work hard, yet feel hollow. You do much, yet feel behind. You finish the day, yet sense that something essential was untouched again. That feeling is not weakness. It is information. It is your inner life telling you that activity alone cannot satisfy a soul that was made for direction. Human beings do not only need occupation, they need coherence. They need to know that the way they spend their energy reflects something real, something chosen, something worthy of the limited years they have been given. So what does rebuilding look like here? It begins with the courage to separate what is important from what is merely consuming you. It begins by noticing which tasks genuinely serve your mission and which ones simply keep you psychologically busy. It means admitting that some forms of productivity are sophisticated procrastination. It means accepting that a clear hour spent on the right thing is worth more than a frantic day spent on 20 wrong things. And it means being willing to disappoint the false image of yourself as endlessly available in order to become truly faithful to what matters. That kind of life can look less impressive from the outside at first. It may look quieter, simpler, more selective. You may answer less, attend less, explain less, and scatter yourself less. But internally, something stronger begins to form. Your energy gathers. Your mind stops leaking through constant reaction. Your days start carrying weight again because they are no longer filled only with activity. They are structured by intention. That is when busyness loses its charm. That is when you stop worshipping a crowded schedule and start respecting a focused life. Because the truth is hard, but clean. A full calendar can still hide an empty direction. A restless day can still produce nothing of substance. And a person can stay busy for years while quietly avoiding the one life he was meant to build. Once you truly understand that, you stop asking, "How much did I do today?" and begin asking a more serious question. Did I spend myself on what actually matters? That is the question that saves a life from being consumed by motion and rebuilt around purpose. The fourth truth, a scattered mind creates a wasted life. There is a reason your life feels weaker when your attention is broken, and it is not just because you get less done. It is because attention is not a small thing. Attention is the channel through which your life is lived. Whatever your mind keeps returning to begins shaping your inner world, your habits, your emotions, your standards, your sense of meaning, and eventually, your future. So when your attention is constantly divided, interrupted, pulled in 10 directions, and trained to live in fragments, your life begins to take on that same fragmented quality. You start many things and deepen very few. You think often, but rarely think clearly. You feel busy inside, yet strangely empty. You want a stronger life, but your energy never gathers long enough to build one. This is one of the harshest Stoic truths because modern life makes scatteredness feel normal. In fact, it often rewards it. The mind is taught to jump quickly, react instantly, consume constantly, compare endlessly, and remain available at all times. You open your phone for one reason and leave it 10 minutes later without remembering what that reason was. You sit down to work, and within moments part of your mind is wandering toward noise, messages, stimulation, unfinished thoughts, and low-level urges for novelty. Even when nothing dramatic is happening, the mind stays restless. It becomes difficult to read deeply, reflect honestly, stay with one hard question, or give your full presence to anything that unfolds slowly. And yet this scattered condition is treated as ordinary, almost harmless. But it is not harmless. It is expensive, because a divided mind cannot produce a directed life. Marcus Aurelius understood this danger in a timeless way. He kept pulling himself back to simplicity, to the present task, to the present duty, to the present thought. Not because simplicity is aesthetically pleasing, but because the soul loses power when it is dragged around by everything. A mind that belongs to every interruption cannot belong to itself. And when the mind no longer belongs to itself, life stops feeling chosen. It starts feeling invaded. You are no longer moving from the center of your principles. You are moving from impulse to impulse, distraction to distraction, emotional cue to emotional cue. That is not freedom. It only looks like freedom because no one is visibly controlling you. But inwardly, you are being ruled by fragmentation. And fragmentation always creates a strange form of suffering. It is not always loud suffering. It is often subtle. You feel mentally crowded, but not fulfilled. You feel stimulated, but not strengthened. You feel connected to everything but rooted in nothing. There is always input, always noise, always another piece of information, another clip, another opinion, another urge, another task, another open mental tab. And because of that, the mind rarely experiences wholeness. It rarely settles deeply enough to produce insight, conviction, discipline, or peace. The result is that even your better intentions stay weak. You want to change, but the mind is too dispersed. You want to create, but the energy is too scattered. You want clarity, but you keep feeding confusion faster than clarity can form. This is why a scattered mind does not merely make you inefficient. It makes your whole existence thinner, because depth requires continuity of attention. Character requires continuity of attention. Meaning requires continuity of attention. You cannot build anything real in a state of constant inner interruption. Not a body, not a craft, not a purpose, not self-respect, not a relationship with truth. The deepest parts of life reveal themselves slowly and only to a mind capable of staying. Staying with effort, staying with silence, staying with discomfort, staying with one question longer than the distracted mind wants to. But when attention has been trained by endless stimulation, staying begins to feel unbearable. The nervous system starts craving movement, even when stillness is exactly what healing and direction require. Epictetus would say the issue is not simply what enters the mind, but whether you are governing your impressions or being dragged by them. That distinction matters more than ever. Every impression wants something from you. Every notification asks for a fragment of your awareness. Every bit of gossip wants emotional entry. Every shallow pleasure wants repetition. Every anxiety wants rehearsal. Every temptation says, just for a moment. But moments accumulate. Repetition trains the mind. And eventually, the mind becomes what it repeatedly does. If it repeatedly breaks focus, it becomes weak in focus. If it repeatedly escapes effort, it becomes fragile in effort. If it repeatedly seeks stimulation, it becomes poor at depth. So the real danger is not one distraction. It is the identity formed by thousands of them. And once that identity forms, life begins to slip in ways that are difficult to see at first. You become less decisive because your thoughts never stay still long enough to mature. You become less disciplined because your impulses are always being fed. You become more reactive because silence no longer feels natural. You become more anxious because the mind has forgotten how to rest inside one thing at a time. You begin losing the ability to endure boredom. And that matters because boredom is often the doorway to deeper concentration. If you always run the moment reality becomes slow, then you never reach the layer beneath the restlessness. You never reach the layer where insight forms, where courage strengthens, where true work begins. Seneca wrote that to be everywhere is to be nowhere. That line feels even more severe now than it did in his time. Because today, a person can be mentally present in dozens of places within a single hour and still be absent from his own life. You can know what everyone is saying and still not know what your own conscience has been trying to tell you for months. You can absorb endless content and still lack one governing truth strong enough to organize your day. You can be informed, entertained, stimulated, updated, and still remain inwardly disordered. That disorder becomes destiny if it is not interrupted, because the quality of your attention becomes the quality of your life. This is why rebuilding begins with protecting attention as if it were sacred, because in many ways it is. A disciplined life is not created only by grand intentions. It is created by what your mind is allowed to serve each day. If your attention belongs to triviality, your life will slowly become trivial. If your attention belongs to fear, your life will shrink around fear. If your attention belongs to comparison, your peace will rot. But if your attention is trained toward what is real, necessary, difficult, and meaningful, then even a quiet day begins building something powerful. The Stoic does not master life by mastering everything. He masters life by returning again and again to what deserves his mind. So the fourth brutal truth is this: a scattered mind does not merely waste hours, it wastes force. It wastes potential. It wastes the possibility of becoming deep, steady, dangerous in the right way. Dangerous to illusion, dangerous to weakness, dangerous to the old life that survives only because your attention remains too divided to replace it. Once you understand that, you stop treating distraction as a harmless habit. You see it for what it really is: a slow theft of presence, power, and purpose. And from that moment on, every act of focus becomes more than productivity. It becomes self-respect. It becomes recovery. It becomes the way you gather your life back into one direction before it disappears into fragments. The fifth truth, delayed truth, becomes a heavier future. There are truths you already know long before you are willing to admit them out loud. You know when a habit is ruining your energy. You know when a relationship is draining your spirit instead of strengthening it. You know when your daily routine is built around escape rather than purpose. You know when your standards have fallen, when your attention is leaking, when your body is being neglected, when your work no longer reflects the life you say you want. Usually, the problem is not ignorance. Usually, the problem is delay. You feel the truth early, but you postpone facing it because facing it would demand something from you. It would demand change, sacrifice, action, confrontation, discipline, honesty, loss, or the end of a comforting illusion. So you wait, you soften it, you rename it. You tell yourself it is not the right time to deal with it, and that is where life becomes heavier than it needed to be. This is one of the cruel laws of existence. A truth ignored does not stay still. It grows weight. It gathers consequences while you look away. It moves quietly into your future and begins hardening there. What could have been corrected while it was still small becomes more expensive later. What could have been healed through early honesty becomes more painful after long neglect. What could have been changed with one brave decision becomes tangled in years of habit, attachment, fear, and emotional fatigue. Time does not only pass while you avoid the truth. Time works on the truth while you avoid it. It gives roots to what should have been removed. It gives momentum to what should have been interrupted. It gives structure to what should never have been allowed to become normal. That is why delay is rarely neutral. It feels passive, but it is active in its effects. You are not simply waiting. You are allowing a direction to continue. You are allowing repetition to become identity. You are allowing weakness to organize itself. You are allowing the avoidable to become difficult and the difficult to become painful. Stoicism speaks with unusual force here because it refuses the fantasy that reality can be negotiated with indefinitely. Marcus Aurelius kept pulling himself back to what was true now, not what he wished were true, not what would feel easier to believe tomorrow, but what stood before him in the present moment. That discipline matters because truth loses none of its force by being postponed. It only becomes less convenient. And the strange thing is that the mind often knows this while still resisting it. You can feel it in the body. There is a low, quiet tension when you are living against what you know. It may not always become dramatic, but it accumulates. A kind of inner friction begins to form. You become tired in ways rest does not solve. You become irritated in ways circumstances alone cannot explain. You become mentally crowded because part of your energy is always being used to suppress what your conscience keeps trying to bring forward. It is exhausting to live in quiet argument with reality. It drains strength because the soul was not made to flourish in self-deception. Seneca understood this deeply. He wrote about how people suffer more in imagination than in reality, and one reason for that is this constant internal rehearsal around truths they refuse to meet directly. The longer you circle the truth, the more power it seems to gain over you. You see this clearly when someone keeps postponing a necessary change. The job is wrong, but they stay. The environment is draining, but they remain inside it. The body is sending signals, but they ignore them. The addiction is growing, but they keep explaining it away. The calling is clear, but they continue choosing comfort. The truth has already arrived, yet they keep treating it like something that will become easier if left untouched. But delayed truth does not become easier. It becomes heavier because now you are carrying both the original problem and the burden of all the time lost refusing to face it. Now there is regret mixed into it. Now there is weakened confidence mixed into it. Now there is the pain of knowing you abandoned yourself repeatedly while pretending you simply needed more time. That is why self-betrayal and delayed truth are so closely connected. Every time you refuse a truth you already know, you teach yourself something dangerous. You teach yourself that your deeper knowing can be overridden by fear, by convenience, by mood, by comfort, by social pressure, by habit. And once that pattern repeats enough, self-trust begins to collapse. You stop believing your own insights because you have trained yourself not to honor them. Then, even when clarity comes, it does not move you the way it should, because some part of you expects that you will delay again. This is one of the hidden costs of avoidance. It is not only that the problem grows, it is that the part of you that should act on truth becomes weaker through repeated disobedience. Epictetus would remind you that freedom begins when you stop demanding that reality be other than it is. That sounds simple, but it cuts very deep. A delayed truth is often just reality that your ego has not agreed to yet. You want the relationship to work, even though the pattern is clear. You want the lazy version of yourself to somehow produce a disciplined life. You want distraction to coexist with depth. You want to keep the same habits and receive a different future. But reality keeps standing there, unchanged by preference. The Stoic path is not cold because it tells the truth. It is merciful because it tells the truth early before illusion becomes destiny. And this is where the fifth brutal truth becomes a turning point. The moment you stop delaying what you already know, life begins losing unnecessary weight. Not because action is easy, but because conflict decreases. Your energy is no longer being split between what is true and what is convenient. Your mind is no longer spending all day rehearsing half-honest explanations. Your body is no longer carrying the tension of a life lived out of alignment. A clean pain replaces a dirty one. The clean pain is the discomfort of action, confrontation, change, endings, discipline, and responsibility. The dirty pain is the slow corrosion of avoiding all of that while pretending you're fine. One kind of pain rebuilds you, the other kind quietly weakens you. This is why courage matters so much in rebuilding a life. Not dramatic courage, not performative courage, just the plain, unglamorous courage to say, this is true, and I will stop pretending otherwise. This habit is costing me. This relationship is not healthy. This environment is lowering me. This routine is making me smaller. This version of me cannot take me where I need to go. There is power in that kind of honesty because it ends the leak. It stops the future from becoming heavier through continued denial. It interrupts the drift right where it is happening. So if there is something in your life you already know but keep postponing, do not call that patience. Call it what it is, delay, and understand the cost clearly. The truth you refuse today does not disappear tonight. It waits for you in the future with added weight, added consequence, added regret, added weakness. That is the brutal part. But here is the hopeful part. The moment you face it, the future stops getting heavier in that particular way. It may still be hard, but it becomes clean. And a clean, hard life is always lighter than a false, easy one. That is the fifth brutal truth. Delayed truth becomes a heavier future. The sooner you face what you already know, the sooner your life stops being crushed by the weight of what should have been handled long ago. The sixth truth. Weak standards create weak lives. A life does not become strong by accident. It becomes strong because certain things are no longer negotiable, certain behaviors are no longer tolerated, certain excuses no longer sound convincing to you, even when they come from your own mind. That is what standards really are. They are not slogans. They are not preferences. They are not the things you say you value when you feel inspired. Standards are the line where your life begins to take shape. They determine what enters your day, what stays in your environment, what gets repeated, what gets corrected, what you accept from yourself, and what you refuse to normalize any longer. And this is why weak standards create weak lives. Because whatever you tolerate consistently becomes part of your reality, whether you intended it or not. This is one of the hardest truths to accept because it removes the comfort of blaming life for what you keep permitting. The moment you see that your standards are shaping your existence, you can no longer pretend that everything is just happening to you. You have to admit that some forms of suffering stay in place not because they are impossible to change, but because they have been repeatedly allowed. A disordered room may seem small, but repeated disorder trains a careless mind. A lazy morning may seem harmless, but repeated lazy mornings build a weak rhythm. A draining relationship may seem complicated, but repeated access teaches that your peace can be disturbed without consequence. An unhealthy habit may seem temporary, but what is repeated becomes structure. Life hardens around what you accept. That is why standards are not abstract. They are physical. They show up in your sleep, your posture, your calendar, your bank account, your body, your tone of voice, your concentration, your relationships, your emotional stability, your willingness to endure discomfort, and the way you spend an ordinary afternoon when nobody is watching. You do not rise to a better life through wishing. You rise by deciding what version of life is no longer acceptable to you. Marcus Aurelius did not become Marcus Aurelius because he waited for noble feelings to appear every morning. He repeatedly returned to a standard. He reminded himself what a human being ought to be, how one should act, how one should meet duty, irritation, fatigue, temptation, and difficulty. He understood that character is not formed in grand declarations. It is formed in repeated refusals to sink beneath your own principles. And yet, this is where many people lose years. They want a stronger life while maintaining weak tolerances. They want peace, but tolerate chaos. They want discipline, but tolerate constant indulgence. They want self-respect, but tolerate people and habits that steadily undermine it. They want clarity, but tolerate endless noise. They want transformation, but keep leaving the door open for every behavior that prevents it. Then they wonder why life feels unstable. But stability is impossible when standards are low, because low standards guarantee leakage. Energy leaks, time leaks, attention leaks, confidence leaks, dignity leaks. You are always rebuilding what you should have protected in the first place. Seneca understood this in a deep moral sense. He knew that the soul is shaped by what it repeatedly consents to. That word matters, consents, because not everything destructive in life arrives by force. Much of it enters through permission. A person with weak standards keeps making silent agreements with what diminishes him. He says yes to one more hour of numb distraction, yes to one more compromise, yes to one more environment that lowers his spirit, yes to one more excuse dressed as kindness toward himself. At first, these seem like small permissions. but eventually they become a pattern, and the pattern becomes a way of life. Then what once felt like a choice begins to feel like personality. This is just how I am. No. Often it is simply what you have practiced long enough to mistake for identity. This is where Stoicism becomes very sharp. Because Stoicism does not ask what mood you are in. It asks what you are willing to live by. It does not care much for self-description if your behavior keeps telling the truth. You can call yourself ambitious, disciplined, spiritual, serious, focused, selective, or committed, but your standards will reveal whether those words are real. What do you allow into your mind each day? What do you permit your hands to do with your time? What tone do you accept in your relationships? What level of integrity do you demand from yourself when no one will punish you for lowering it? These questions are uncomfortable because they expose the gap between image and structure, and life is always built by structure, not image. Epictetus would likely say that freedom belongs to the person who has learned to govern himself. But self-government is impossible without standards. Without them, the day gets ruled by appetite, impulse, mood, convenience, and pressure from outside. One rough emotion can change your behavior. One temptation can redirect your focus. One uncomfortable conversation can make you betray your own values. That is not inner freedom. That is inner weakness wearing the clothes of flexibility. Standards create a spine. They allow a person to remain himself across different moods, different pressures, different seasons. They make action less dependent on feeling and more rooted in principle. That is why standards do not restrict your life in the deeper sense. They rescue it from chaos. There is also a quiet spiritual dimension to this. When your standards are weak, you begin losing respect for yourself in subtle ways. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it is just a quiet disappointment that follows you. A sense that you keep witnessing your own potential and then abandoning it. A feeling that you cannot fully trust yourself because you have made too many private concessions. This is heavier than many people realize. Self-respect does not come mainly from talent or praise. It comes from seeing yourself uphold what matters, even when it is inconvenient. It comes from being able to say, at least here, at least in this part of my life, I do not bend so easily anymore. That kind of self-respect becomes strength. It gives weight to your words. It steadies the mind. It creates peace because you are no longer internally divided. Of course, raising standards is uncomfortable. It means losing the false comfort of vagueness. It means becoming clear. Clear about what you will no longer consume. Clear about how you will no longer spend your nights. Clear about what access people will no longer have to your time, your body, your energy, your inner balance. Clear about what excuses you personally will stop entertaining. Clear about the difference between a setback and a pattern. Clear about where softness has become sabotage. This can feel harsh at first, especially if you have spent years trying to keep peace by allowing too much. But real peace never grows from tolerated disorder. It grows from clean boundaries, clean habits, clean priorities, and a clean refusal to keep feeding what weakens you. And that is the turning point. The moment your standards rise, life starts reorganizing itself. Not instantly, not magically, but inevitably. Your days become less crowded with nonsense because less nonsense is allowed to stay. Your mind becomes less noisy because you stop giving noise unlimited entry. Your body begins to change because indulgence loses automatic permission. Your relationships shift because people feel the difference between someone who merely complains and someone who has actually drawn a line. Even your future changes because the repeated behaviors shaping it are no longer random. Standards give your life form. They make it harder for you to drift back into what once felt normal. So the sixth brutal truth is this: weak standards do not merely create small problems, they create an entire weak life. They create days that feel loose, identities that feel unstable, and futures that feel disappointing because nothing strong has been defended consistently enough to grow. But once you stop asking what you prefer and start deciding what you will no longer tolerate, everything begins changing at the root. That is when your life stops being built by accident. That is when strength stops being a fantasy and starts becoming a structure. And that is when rebuilding becomes real. The seventh truth: identity matters more than motivation. One of the biggest reasons people keep rebuilding their lives in theory but not in reality is that they put too much faith in motivation and not enough faith in identity. They wait for the right emotional weather. They wait for a strong morning, a clear mind, a burst of energy, a wave of inspiration, a moment when action suddenly feels natural and resistance goes quiet. And when that feeling appears, they move. They make plans, set goals, promise change, imagine a different future. But then motivation leaves, as it always does, and with it goes the version of themselves they were briefly performing. That is the tragedy. Not that motivation fades, it was always going to fade, but that so many people built their hopes on something so temporary. Stoicism asks for a much deeper foundation. It asks you to stop asking, "Do I feel ready to act?" and start asking, "Who am I deciding to be, even when I do not feel like it?" That shift changes everything, because motivation is emotional. Identity is structural. Motivation comes in flashes. Identity is what remains when emotion changes. Motivation can make you begin, but identity is what determines whether you continue when the day becomes heavy, repetitive, inconvenient, or dull. And most of life is built in those exact conditions, not in dramatic moments, not in cinematic bursts of inspiration, but in the ordinary hour when you are tired, distracted, tempted or discouraged, and still must decide whether you are the kind of person who keeps his word to himself. That is why identity matters more. A person with strong identity does not need to feel powerful every day. He needs to know what kind of man he refuses to stop being. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He did not wake up every morning asking whether he felt inspired enough to live with discipline. He reminded himself of what his nature required. He returned again and again to the question of what it means to act as a rational, upright, self-governing human being. That is identity language. It is not based on mood, it is based on character. And once life is organized around character, your behavior becomes less fragile. You're no longer depending on temporary emotion to carry permanent responsibility. You act because it fits who you are becoming, not because the moment feels ideal. This is why people often fail, even when they sincerely want change. They are trying to force new habits onto an old identity. They say they want discipline, but still think of themselves as someone who gives in easily. They say they want peace, but still identify with chaos, drama, reaction, and mental noise. They say they want strength, but still secretly protect the self-image of being overwhelmed, unlucky, inconsistent, or always trying to get it together. And that internal story matters more than most people realize, because behavior tends to return to whatever identity feels familiar. You can borrow a new routine for a week, you can imitate discipline for a month, but if your deeper self-concept has not changed, you will keep drifting back to the old standard because the old self still feels like home. That is the hidden power of identity. It shapes what feels natural. If you see yourself as a distracted person, focus will always feel like an unnatural effort. If you see yourself as someone who struggles with consistency, then inconsistency will keep finding a way back into your routine because your mind still sees it as part of you. If you see yourself as weak around comfort, then every difficult moment will seem like confirmation of that weakness. But once identity begins to change, discipline stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like self-respect. You are no longer forcing behavior from the outside. You are expressing something from within. That difference is enormous. Epictetus would say that you become what you practice in relation to your impressions, your desires, your fears, and your choices. In other words, identity is not something you discover by accident. It is something you shape through repeated alignment. Every time you act in accordance with the stronger self, you make that self more believable. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, even a small one, identity thickens. Every time you refuse an excuse, return to your standard, protect your attention, endure discomfort, or choose long-term meaning over short-term relief, you are casting a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. And those votes matter far more than emotional speeches you give yourself in moments of inspiration. This is also why self-betrayal hurts so much. It is not only because you failed at a task, it is because each private betrayal reinforces an identity you do not want. You say you are serious, then you fold at the first discomfort. You say you want to rebuild your life, then you disappear into distraction for hours. You say you are done living weakly, then you negotiate with the same excuse again. Over time, this creates inner division. You stop trusting your own declarations because too many of them collapsed on contact with reality. Then motivation becomes even less reliable because part of you no longer believes your enthusiasm means anything. That is why identity repair is so important. You do not rebuild self-trust by feeling inspired. You rebuild it by acting in a way that makes the new identity credible. Seneca understood that character is a kind of moral architecture. It is built slowly, strengthened through repetition, and proven under pressure. This is what makes identity so much more valuable than motivation. Motivation is loud, but often thin. Identity is quieter, but heavier. Motivation says, "I want to change." Identity says, "This is no longer who I am." Motivation says, "I hope I can stay consistent." Identity says, "Consistency is part of my standard now." Motivation depends on excitement. Identity depends on decision. And decision, when repeated enough, becomes fate. There is also a deeper peace that comes when identity becomes clearer. Life stops feeling like a constant negotiation with yourself. You do not wake up every day needing to reinvent your commitment from the beginning. You do not keep asking whether discipline is worth it, whether distraction can be justified, whether your standards should bend just this once. Some things become settled, not because you are rigid, but because you are rooted. And rooted people waste less energy on inner argument. They have already decided what kind of life they are building. That decision gives force to their days. It simplifies action. It reduces friction. It allows progress to continue even when emotion is absent. This is what rebuilding a life actually demands. Not endless motivation, but an identity strong enough to survive low moods, boring days, private setbacks, slow progress, and the absence of applause. You need an identity that can carry you when the mind says, "Rest in weakness, delay again, skip this one, lower the standard, nobody will know." In those moments, motivation is usually gone, but identity can still speak. It can say, "Maybe no one else will know, but I will know." It can say, "I do not live that way anymore." It can say, "This action may be small, but it belongs to the man I am building." And that voice, when strengthened enough, becomes more powerful than emotion. So the seventh brutal truth is this: motivation is not enough to save a life. It is too unstable, too emotional, too temporary. If you want to rebuild yourself for real, you need something firmer. You need an identity that can hold under pressure, an identity shaped by repeated action, honest self-respect, and a refusal to keep living beneath your own potential. Once that identity begins to take form, everything changes. Discipline becomes less dramatic. Action becomes less negotiable. Purpose becomes less abstract. and the life you keep trying to force through bursts of emotion finally begins to grow through something much stronger, the person you have decided quietly and seriously to become. The eighth truth: self-betrayal happens in small daily moments. A life rarely falls apart all at once. That is one of the hardest things to understand when you are trying to rebuild yourself. You imagine collapse as something dramatic, one terrible mistake, one major loss, one visible failure that changes everything in a single moment. But in reality, the deeper damage usually happens more quietly than that. It happens in small daily moments where you go against what you already know is right. It happens when you promise yourself you will wake up early, then train yourself to ignore your own word. It happens when you know you need silence, but choose noise because truth feels heavier in silence. It happens when you know a habit is lowering you, but you keep letting it stay because removing it would require discomfort. This is how self-betrayal works. Not always through dramatic destruction, but through repeated private disobedience to your own deeper knowledge. And that is why it is so dangerous. Large failures at least announce themselves. Small betrayals often look harmless. They seem too ordinary to matter. 1 hour wasted, one weak decision, one avoided task, one more excuse, one more compromise, one more day spent living beneath the standard you claim to care about. Yet these moments are never really isolated. They are forming a relationship between you and yourself. Every time you act against your own conscience, even in a small way, you teach yourself something. You teach yourself that your promises can be broken. You teach yourself that your clarity can be postponed. You teach yourself that what you know does not have to become what you do. And once that pattern deepens, self-respect starts eroding from the inside. This is where the Stoics become severe in the most useful way. They understood that character is not built mainly in public moments. It is built in the hidden ones. Marcus Aurelius was constantly bringing himself back to the inner standard, not because he was obsessed with perfection, but because he knew the soul becomes shaped by what it repeatedly allows. A person does not become weak only through obvious vice. He becomes weak through inconsistency between what he sees and what he does, through knowing better and repeatedly living lower, through speaking to himself in noble language while behaving in ways that quietly train the opposite. That inner contradiction is exhausting. It drains force. It divides the personality. It makes life heavier because part of you is always carrying the disappointment of witnessing your own retreat. And maybe you know exactly what that feels like. Not the pain of failing publicly, but the quieter pain of failing privately in ways no one else can measure. You said this week would be different, and then it unfolded like the last 10. You felt the truth clearly in the morning, but by evening you had negotiated with the same old patterns again. You told yourself you were done tolerating what weakens you, then gave it access anyway. That pain is hard to explain because it does not always leave visible evidence. From the outside, everything may still look normal, but inwardly something has been touched. A little trust has been lost. A little dignity has been traded. A little more distance has opened between the person you could be and the person you keep choosing to be. Seneca understood that the soul suffers when it is not in harmony with itself. That is the real wound of self-betrayal. It is not only that you delayed progress, it is that you moved against your own integrity. And integrity is not just morality in the narrow sense. It is wholeness. It is the condition of not being split against yourself. When your beliefs, values, intentions, and actions begin aligning, life gets cleaner, simpler, stronger. But when you repeatedly betray what you know, even in small daily ways, you create internal fracture. One part of you wants depth, discipline, honesty, peace. Another part keeps choosing ease, avoidance, distraction, and temporary relief. That inner split becomes a way of life if it is not confronted. This is also why self-betrayal almost always hides behind very reasonable language. The mind rarely says, "I am abandoning myself today." It says, "I'll do it tomorrow." It says, "I'm just tired." It says, "This one time doesn't matter." It says, "I need a little comfort." It says, "I'll start when I feel more focused." These sentences do not sound dangerous at first. They sound human. Sometimes they even sound compassionate. But when they become repetitive, they stop being explanations and become permissions. Permissions to keep leaking your life in ways too small to scare you immediately, but serious enough to shape your future. That is the frightening part. Your life can be quietly redirected by repeated small permissions that never felt dramatic enough to resist. Epictetus would likely tell you that the crucial question is not whether you feel strong in the abstract, but whether you govern your choices when the test appears. And the test often appears in very ordinary form. Not in grand tragedy. In the next hour. In whether you keep your focus or surrender it. In whether you tell the truth or soften it. In whether you choose the meaningful task or the easy escape. In whether you honor the boundary or let it blur again. In whether you behave like the person you keep claiming to become. This is where lives change, not in fantasy, but in repeated moments of decision that look too small to matter and yet matter enormously because they are teaching your character what to become. The hopeful side of this truth is that if self-betrayal happens in small daily moments, then self-restoration happens there too. You do not repair your life only through one huge breakthrough. You repair it by ending the quiet betrayals one by one, by becoming someone whose word to himself starts meaning something again, by keeping a simple promise, by closing one door you should have closed months ago, by doing one difficult thing without negotiation, by telling yourself the truth without adding a comforting lie beside it. These acts may look minor from the outside, but inwardly they are revolutionary, because every kept promise begins rebuilding trust, where repeated compromise once destroyed it. That is how self-respect returns, not through self-hype, not through saying beautiful things about discipline while continuing to live carelessly. It returns through evidence, through small, plain, repeated evidence that you are no longer willing to abandon yourself in the moments where it would be easiest. The first few times it may feel almost invisible, but your inner life notices. The part of you that has been disappointed for a long time notices. It sees that maybe this time the promise was real. Maybe this time the line will hold. Maybe this time the stronger self is no longer just a thought, but a pattern beginning to form. So the eighth brutal truth is this: self-betrayal does not usually arrive with a dramatic warning. It happens in small daily moments where you repeatedly choose against your own deeper knowing. That is how a strong life gets weakened. That is how years get misused. That is how dignity leaks out of a person without any public collapse. But that is also why rebuilding is possible right now, because the next small moment is already coming. And in that moment, you can either repeat the betrayal or begin ending it. One honest choice at a time, one kept promise at a time, one unglamorous act of integrity at a time. That is how a person stops abandoning himself and starts becoming someone he can finally trust again. The ninth truth: excuses are negotiations with discomfort. One of the most painful things you discover when you begin taking your life seriously is that many of the reasons you have been giving yourself are not really reasons at all. They are negotiations. Negotiations with discomfort, negotiations with effort, negotiations with uncertainty, embarrassment, fatigue, fear, boredom, rejection, slowness, and the quiet pain of doing something before it feels natural. That is why excuses can be so dangerous. They do not always sound dishonest. In fact, they often sound intelligent, reasonable, even compassionate. They arrive in careful language. They present themselves as realism. They tell you the timing is off, the energy is low, the mood is wrong, the conditions are not ideal, the mind is too crowded, the body is too tired, the day is too messy, the task is too unclear, and sometimes parts of that may even be true. But Stoicism forces a harder question. Is this a real barrier, or is this the mind bargaining to avoid discomfort? That question matters because a large part of wasted life does not come from inability. It comes from repeated permission to step away from necessary friction. The human mind is incredibly skillful at protecting itself from what feels unpleasant in the moment. It can make avoidance sound wise. It can turn fear into logic. It can dress reluctance in analysis. It can make delay look responsible. You say you are waiting for clarity, but maybe you are avoiding the discomfort of starting without certainty. You say you are protecting your peace, but maybe you are avoiding the discomfort of discipline. You say you need more time to think, but maybe you are avoiding the discomfort of committing. The excuse is not always a lie in content. Often it is a lie in function. It exists less to tell the truth than to protect you from the emotional cost of action. And this is where the problem becomes spiritual, not merely practical, because every excuse you repeatedly accept teaches your character something. It teaches you that discomfort has veto power. It teaches you that your higher intentions can be overruled by a passing emotional resistance. It teaches you that when the road becomes inconvenient, your standards become flexible. Over time, this forms a pattern. The life you say you want remains untouched in the distance, while the life you actually live keeps being governed by what feels easiest to tolerate today. Then the months begin disappearing into a strange loop. You still care. You still want more. You still imagine the stronger version of yourself. But the bridge between intention and behavior keeps collapsing at the same point, the moment discomfort enters. The Stoics were ruthless about this because they understood something most people spend years avoiding. A meaningful life will always require doing things that do not feel pleasant at first. Marcus Aurelius did not tell himself to wait until he felt inspired to act according to his nature. He reminded himself that he was made for action, responsibility, endurance, service, and discipline. That is a very different posture. It is not based on emotional convenience. It is based on duty to what is highest in you. And once you understand that, excuses begin losing some of their glamour. You stop asking whether discomfort is present and start asking whether discomfort is simply part of the path. Usually it is. Seneca also knew that the mind has a habit of exaggerating the pain of effort before action begins. The thing you are resisting often feels larger in anticipation than in reality. The workout feels impossible until it starts. The difficult conversation feels unbearable until the first honest sentence is spoken. The focused hour of work feels oppressive until you enter it. The truth feels terrifying until you finally say it plainly. The mind invents resistance because it wants relief now. That is why excuses thrive most strongly before movement. They are a defense mechanism against the unknown cost of effort. But once action begins, much of that imagined weight dissolves. This is one of the great humiliations of excuse-making. You often realize after finally doing the thing that what controlled you was not reality itself, but your emotional interpretation of it. Still, excuses remain powerful because they give immediate comfort. They let you leave the battlefield without calling it retreat. They let you protect your self-image while abandoning your standard. You do not have to say, "I chose weakness." You can say, "Today just was not the right day." And once in a while, that may be fair, but repeated enough, that sentence becomes identity. It becomes the language of someone who is always almost ready, almost beginning, almost disciplined, almost transformed, almost. And that word quietly ruins lives, because life is not rebuilt in the realm of almost. It is rebuilt when negotiation ends. Epictetus would likely say that what disturbs people is not events themselves, but the judgments they make about them. The same principle applies here. The task is not always the true obstacle. Your judgment about the task is often the obstacle. You call it too hard, too uncomfortable, too exhausting, too uncertain, too boring, too humiliating, too late, too early, too much. But perhaps the real issue is that you have spent too long obeying every internal protest as if it carried authority. Once that happens, excuses multiply because the mind realizes it can delay action simply by generating enough emotional static. A little doubt, a little fatigue, a little anxiety, a little inconvenience, and suddenly the whole day gets redirected. This is why rebuilding your life requires learning to hear excuses differently. Instead of listening to them as facts, you begin hearing them as signals. Signals that discomfort has appeared. Signals that resistance is near the very place growth is being asked of you. Signals that the old self is trying to preserve itself. That shift is powerful because it breaks the spell. The excuse no longer sounds like final truth. It sounds like negotiation. And once you hear negotiation clearly, you can stop participating in it. You can say, yes, this feels inconvenient, and I will still act. Yes, I feel resistance, and I will still keep the appointment with my own standard. Yes, I am tired, uncertain, uninspired, restless, and still I will do what must be done. This does not mean becoming cruel toward yourself. Stoicism is not self-abuse. It is self-government. There is a difference between genuine limits and emotional bargaining. A wise person learns that difference honestly. Some days do require rest. Some setbacks are real. Some burdens need to be respected. But many excuses are not about limitation. They are about reluctance. And reluctance cannot be allowed to rule a life that is trying to become strong. Because once reluctance becomes authority, purpose becomes fragile. Discipline becomes optional. Character becomes conditional, and a conditional character cannot build an uncommon life. So the ninth brutal truth is this: excuses are rarely neutral explanations. Most of the time they are negotiations with discomfort. They are the mind trying to escape the price of becoming, and that price will always include effort, uncertainty, repetition, boredom, and days when you would rather do almost anything else. The question is not whether those days will come. They will. The question is whether you will keep bargaining with them until your life slips away, or whether you will finally decide that discomfort no longer gets to vote on everything that matters. That is when something changes. That is when your future stops being held hostage by temporary resistance. That is when action becomes cleaner, standards become firmer, and the life you keep postponing finally starts taking form in the only place it ever could. On the other side of the excuses, you are no longer willing to believe. The 10th truth, waiting to feel ready, is how years disappear. One of the most expensive mistakes a person can make is believing that serious action should begin only after a certain feeling arrives. You tell yourself you are waiting for readiness, but often what you are really doing is giving fear a more respectable name. Readiness sounds intelligent. It sounds responsible. It sounds like maturity. It sounds better than admitting that you are hesitant, uncertain, intimidated, or unwilling to step into a version of life that will immediately ask more from you. So the mind says, not yet. A little later, after I think more. After things calm down, after I become clearer, after I have more confidence, more energy, more certainty, more discipline, more time. But life does not stop while you prepare to begin living it. That is the brutality of this truth. The years do not wait for your inner agreement. They keep moving, and many lives are quietly consumed in the space between intention and action. The tragedy is not that people lack desire. Very often they know exactly what they want to change. They know they need to get serious about their body, their habits, their work, their inner life, their standards, their calling, their relationships, their use of time. The knowledge is there. The discomfort is there. Sometimes even the vision is there. What is missing is not awareness, but decision. And decision keeps getting delayed because they think they must first arrive at some emotional state that makes change feel clean and natural, but meaningful change rarely begins that way. It usually begins awkwardly, imperfectly, without full confidence, without the right mood, without total clarity, without the comforting sensation that you are fully prepared. The Stoic insight here is simple and severe. Action does not wait for readiness. Readiness is often produced by action. Marcus Aurelius never wrote like a man waiting for ideal internal conditions. He wrote like someone constantly dragging himself back to what must be done, even when the body resisted, even when the mind was heavy, even when the day did not offer a heroic mood. He reminded himself that he was getting up to do the work of a human being. That is such an important correction because modern thinking often turns action into something emotional. You act when you feel aligned, when inspiration rises, when confidence appears. But the Stoics understood that a life built this way becomes fragile very quickly. If action depends on readiness, then your future depends on a feeling. And feelings are unstable. They shift with sleep, weather, stress, hormones, setbacks, memories, conversations, and countless things that do not deserve that much authority over your destiny. Waiting to feel ready also creates a hidden psychological loop. The longer you delay, the larger the task seems. The larger it seems, the less ready you feel. The less ready you feel, the longer you delay. And so the mind keeps feeding the very condition it claims to be waiting to overcome. This is why years can disappear so quietly, not because you were doing nothing, but because the important things kept being pushed into a future version of yourself who was supposedly going to be more prepared than you are now. But that future self does not appear automatically. He is built by what you do before you feel ready. He is built the first time you begin clumsily. The first time you choose the hard thing with shaky confidence, the first time you move while doubt is still in the room. That is how readiness is forged. Not in theory, but in contact with reality. Seneca warned against living as if life were something abundant and endlessly available. He saw clearly that postponement is one of the most elegant forms of self-destruction because it feels so harmless while it's happening. You're not saying no forever, you're just saying not yet. But enough not yets become a life. Enough delays become an identity. Enough waiting becomes a habit of non-arrival, where you're always mentally near transformation but never fully inside it. That state is dangerous because it allows you to keep admiring the life you should be building while remaining untouched by the cost of actually building it. You become a spectator of your own potential. And maybe that is why this truth cuts so deeply, because many people are not lost in confusion. They are lost in postponement. They do not need 10 more books, 20 more motivational speeches, or another season of private planning. They need to stop treating readiness as an entry requirement for action. The body becomes stronger by training before it feels strong. The mind becomes clearer by deciding before everything is perfectly understood. Discipline becomes real by being practiced while resistance is still alive. Courage becomes yours by acting before fear leaves. In almost every important area of life, the feeling you are waiting for is created by the very movement you are avoiding. Epictetus would likely say that philosophy is not about admiring principles, but about embodying them under real conditions. That matters here, because the fantasy of readiness often lets you stay in the realm of admiration. You admire discipline, you admire simplicity, you admire courage, you admire focus, you admire a life of purpose. But admiration is not transformation. There is a painful gap between loving an idea and submitting your life to it. And that gap is usually crossed in a very unglamorous way. Through beginning badly, through repeating before it feels natural, through enduring the embarrassment of being a beginner, through continuing while your emotions lag behind your decision. This is why waiting is so seductive. It protects you from the discomfort of becoming visible to yourself in the early, unimpressive phase of change. But the early phase is where lives are saved, not because it looks impressive. Usually it does not. The first days of rebuilding are often small and almost invisible. A walk, a deleted app, an honest boundary, a focused hour, a quiet refusal, a morning routine followed before it feels meaningful, a conversation you have delayed for months, a commitment kept on a low-energy day. None of these things look like the dramatic breakthrough the mind fantasizes about. But this is exactly how years stop disappearing. They stop disappearing when your life is no longer governed by the myth that you must feel transformed before you begin transforming. There is also something deeply healing in moving before readiness. It restores authority to the will. It teaches you that hesitation is not sovereignty. It reminds you that your fear can speak without becoming commander. Every time you act while not fully ready, you prove something essential to yourself. That uncertainty does not have the final word. That proof matters. Because a person who keeps waiting begins to see himself as someone who always needs one more sign, one more push, one more emotional alignment, one more perfect starting point. But a person who acts before he feels ready begins to see himself differently. He becomes someone who can enter difficulty without being emotionally escorted into it, someone who can build while still unfinished, someone who understands that the door to a better life does not open when you finally feel no fear. It opens when fear is no longer allowed to delay what matters. So the 10th brutal truth is this: waiting to feel ready is one of the quietest ways to lose your life. It feels temporary, but it can stretch across years. It feels thoughtful, but often it is fear protected by elegant language. It feels safe, but it keeps you weak by keeping you outside the very experiences that would make you stronger. The answer is not recklessness. It is honest movement, beginning before the inner weather becomes ideal, taking the next clear step while doubt still exists. Accepting that readiness is not a gift that arrives first, but a condition that grows through use. Because in the end, the life you want will not be built by the person who waited until everything felt right. It will be built by the person who understood something harder and more freeing than that. The right time is usually not a feeling. It is a decision. And the moment you stop waiting for readiness, time stops slipping through your hands in the same old way. That is when the years stop disappearing into preparation and start becoming the raw material of a life lived on purpose. The 11th truth: clarity grows through decision, not endless thought. One of the most convincing traps in a wasted life is the belief that if you just think a little longer, analyze a little deeper, wait a little more carefully, then eventually clarity will arrive in a perfect and undeniable form. You imagine that one more round of reflection will finally remove uncertainty, and once uncertainty is gone, action will become simple. But that is not how life usually works. In fact, the opposite is often true. The longer you remain in endless thought without movement, the more confused you become. Not because thinking is useless, but because thought without decision starts feeding on itself. It circles the same fears, the same possibilities, the same imagined outcomes, the same internal arguments, until what once felt like caution slowly becomes paralysis. And that paralysis often disguises itself as intelligence. This is why this truth feels so brutal. Overthinking can make you feel serious, responsible, careful, deep. It gives you the internal impression that you are engaged with your life, when often you are only postponing contact with it. You review every angle, rehearse every risk, imagine every consequence, question every step, and remain mentally busy enough to believe you are moving toward wisdom. But Stoicism cuts through that illusion with unusual force. It reminds you that life is not revealed only through contemplation. Much of it is revealed through committed action. You do not understand the road by staring at the map forever. At some point, you understand the road by walking it. Marcus Aurelius knew the mind's tendency to wander into unnecessary thought. That is why he kept returning to simplicity, directness, and the duty of the present moment. He understood that a human being can waste enormous energy not only through laziness, but through mental overcomplication. The mind says, "Let me think more," because thinking feels safer than acting. In thought, nothing is risked yet. Nothing is exposed yet. Nothing can fail yet. But nothing can fully form there either. Decision is what gives shape to thought. Decision is what separates a life that remains abstract from a life that begins taking structure in reality. And that is the part many people resist. Decision closes doors. Decision creates consequences. Decision makes your values visible. Decision demands responsibility. As long as you stay in endless thought, you can preserve every option and protect yourself from the pain of being wrong. You can live in possibility instead of commitment. But possibility, when stretched too long, becomes a very elegant prison. It feels expansive, yet it prevents depth. It lets you imagine many lives without building one. It lets you admire many directions without suffering the discipline of choosing a single path and giving yourself to it seriously. This is why clarity so often appears after action rather than before it. Not because action magically solves confusion, but because reality teaches faster than speculation. Once you move, feedback begins. Once you commit, truth starts revealing itself. Once you try, certain illusions collapse. You learn what matters, what does not, what strengthens you, what drains you, what you actually want, what you only thought you wanted, what fear was exaggerating, and where your real difficulties live. None of that becomes fully available through endless private thinking. It becomes visible when thought meets the world. Seneca understood that there is a kind of suffering that comes from being mentally divided too long. The person who never decides remains split within himself. One part leans one way, another part leans another, and because no governing choice is made, the soul never gathers force. Energy gets consumed in internal conflict. You become tired without having acted. You become drained without having built anything. You feel pressure without progress. This is one of the ugliest forms of wasted life, because from the outside it may look like nothing is wrong. You are still planning, still reflecting, still considering. But inwardly, your strength is being diluted by indecision. And indecision has consequences that are often underestimated. It weakens confidence, because confidence is not built mainly by correct thinking. It is built by surviving choice, by choosing, acting, adjusting, learning, and seeing that you can remain standing even when not everything unfolds perfectly. A person who keeps delaying decisions often becomes more fragile, not less. He is not preserving strength. He is preserving inexperience. He is protecting himself from the friction that would have made him sharper. Then, when life forces a decision on him, and eventually it always does, he feels even less prepared because he has trained himself to remain mentally undecided for too long. Epictetus would likely remind you that the real question is not whether all uncertainty can be removed, but whether you are willing to act according to reason despite uncertainty. That is maturity. Not total psychological comfort, but principled movement in the presence of incomplete knowledge. Because no serious life can be built on perfect certainty. Relationships do not come with it. Work does not come with it. Reinvention does not come with it. Discipline does not come with it. You are constantly asked to choose under partial visibility. And if you refuse to move until everything is obvious, life will keep advancing while you remain mentally parked at the edge of your own becoming. There is also a subtle addiction hidden in overthinking. Endless thought can make you feel in control because nothing has been tested yet. In the realm of thought, you can revise endlessly. You can postpone exposure. You can keep the self-image of someone serious without accepting the humility of someone unfinished. But real clarity requires humility. It requires allowing reality to correct you. It requires entering the imperfect process, where you do not know everything, where your first step may be clumsy, where your assumptions may fail, where your plan may need revision. The overthinking mind often fears this because it wants clarity without vulnerability. But life rarely offers them separately. To know more deeply, you usually have to risk being wrong in motion. This is why rebuilding a life depends so much on your relationship with decision. Decision is not always loud. Sometimes it is very quiet. It is the moment you stop debating whether to protect your focus and simply begin protecting it. The moment you stop asking whether a draining habit is truly costing you and finally remove it. The moment you stop reanalyzing the same truth and let your behavior align with what you already know. The moment you stop treating your future like a theory and start ordering your days around it. These decisions may look small, but they create direction. And direction reduces confusion more effectively than endless mental wandering ever will. Notice how different life feels once a real decision has been made. There may still be difficulty. There may still be uncertainty. There may still be slow progress. But something heavy leaves the mind. The endless loop begins to break. Energy that was trapped in internal debate becomes available for action. The soul feels cleaner because it is no longer splitting itself across 20 imagined futures. This is one of the overlooked gifts of decision. It restores force. It gathers you. It ends the leak caused by constant hesitation. You may not know everything yet, but at least now you are learning in one direction. And that is why the 11th brutal truth matters so much. Clarity is not always something you think your way into. Very often it is something you decide your way toward, not recklessly, not blindly, but courageously enough to stop worshipping endless analysis as if it were wisdom. Wisdom knows when thought has done its job. Wisdom knows when another week of circling will not produce new truth, only more delay. Wisdom knows that life answers some questions only after you move. So if your mind has been crowded by too many options, too many imagined outcomes, too many repeated inner conversations, maybe the solution is not more thinking. Maybe the solution is one clean decision, one honest step, one committed act that tells the mind we are no longer living only in theory. Because a person can spend years waiting for perfect clarity and never realize that the missing piece was not information. It was courage. Courage to choose, courage to act, courage to let reality teach what thought alone never could. That is the 11th brutal truth. Clarity grows through decision, not endless thought. And once you accept that, you stop asking your mind to solve everything in advance. You begin walking, learning, correcting, and discovering that the path becomes clearer, not because you stared at it longer, but because you finally had the strength to step onto it. The 12th truth: your environment is either building you or draining you. One of the most underestimated forces in a human life is the environment surrounding that life every single day. People often like to believe that sheer willpower is enough, that if the desire is strong enough and the intentions are pure enough, then they can stay disciplined, focused, calm, and purposeful under any conditions. But Stoicism, properly understood, is not naive about influence. It does not deny personal responsibility. Yet it also does not romanticize the idea that you can place yourself inside chaos, temptation, noise, weak standards, draining people, endless distraction, and a disordered physical space, and somehow remain untouched by all of it. You are not a machine. You are shaped by what repeatedly surrounds you. And that means your environment is never neutral. It is either strengthening your life quietly or weakening it quietly. This truth is brutal because it removes another comforting illusion, the illusion that your struggles are only internal. Sometimes the problem is not that you lack discipline in some mysterious, abstract sense. Sometimes the problem is that your surroundings are set up in a way that constantly pulls you away from the person you are trying to become. Your room encourages laziness, your phone encourages fragmentation, your social circle encourages compromise, your routines encourage drift, your schedule encourages reaction rather than intention, your media diet encourages stimulation rather than clarity, your workspace encourages half-focus, your habits are living inside systems that quietly sabotage them. Then you blame yourself every day for not being stronger, when in reality you are trying to build a meaningful life inside an architecture that keeps training the opposite. And this is where Stoic honesty becomes useful in a very practical way. It asks you to stop seeing the self only as an isolated unit of motivation and start seeing the full structure of your life. Marcus Aurelius constantly guarded what entered his mind because he knew impressions matter. He understood that repeated exposure shapes inner character. Seneca warned about the company you keep because he knew people influence one another at levels deeper than words. Even Epictetus, who emphasized inner freedom, did not teach that you should be careless about what surrounds you. He understood that training the self means being wise about conditions, not pretending conditions have no power. Inner strength is not proven by living foolishly among forces that corrode you. Inner strength is also shown in the wisdom to build a life that supports what is highest in you. Think about how this works in ordinary life. If your phone is always near you, always open, always ready to interrupt your attention, then distraction is no longer an occasional problem. It becomes the default atmosphere of your day. If your room is filled with disorder, unfinished things, visual noise, and signs of neglect, then your nervous system absorbs that message every time you enter. If your conversations are mostly shallow, negative, dramatic, or cynical, then your inner tone begins to drift in the same direction. If the people around you normalize laziness, excuse-making, gossip, impulsiveness, emotional chaos, or mediocrity, then even if you consciously disagree, part of you is still being trained by repeated exposure. Human beings absorb more than they admit. We adapt to what surrounds us. We begin calling normal whatever we see too often. This is why environment matters so much in the rebuilding of a life, because the environment either reduces friction around the better self or increases friction around it. In one environment, discipline has too many enemies. In another, discipline has support. In one environment, every good decision must fight its way through temptation, noise, confusion, and emotional leakage. In another, good decisions become easier because the structure itself is aligned with your aim. The person who wants to focus but leaves every distraction open is making the path harder than it needs to be. The person who wants peace but keeps allowing chaos unlimited access is participating in his own depletion. The person who wants depth but lives in constant stimulation is forcing growth to happen in hostile soil. Seneca once wrote that we should choose carefully the people and influences we allow near us, because we become like those with whom we spend our time. That is not moral panic. It is psychological truth. Environment is not only physical. It is social, emotional, digital, symbolic. It includes the voices you hear most, the energy you absorb most, the emotional climates you keep stepping into, the images and messages that train your desires, the standards that are normal where you live, the pace at which your mind is asked to operate, and the kind of future your daily surroundings quietly suggest is possible. If your environment constantly tells you to be reactive, indulgent, distracted, available, entertained, shallow, and exhausted, then you cannot keep pretending your only problem is a lack of motivation. At the same time, this truth is not an excuse to become helpless or dramatic. Stoicism would reject that too. You may not be able to change every condition immediately. You may not be able to leave every draining place, redesign every circumstance, or distance yourself from every difficult person overnight. But you can begin by becoming conscious. Consciousness itself is powerful. Once you stop treating your environment as invisible, you start seeing where your energy has been leaking. You notice which spaces lower you, which conversations disturb you, which digital habits fracture your mind, which people subtly weaken your standards, which patterns leave you foggy, tired, impulsive, or less able to hear yourself clearly. That awareness is the beginning of freedom, because now you are no longer being shaped unconsciously. And from there, rebuilding becomes concrete. You start removing what does not deserve constant access. You clean what has been left in disorder, because disorder was shaping your mind more than you admitted. You create boundaries around your time because unlimited access was draining your seriousness. You make the good path simpler and the bad path harder. You protect the first hour of your morning. You create silence on purpose. You decide what enters your eyes before it enters your thoughts. You place meaningful tools within reach and cheap escapes further away. You stop treating your surroundings as decoration and start treating them as training. Epictetus would likely say that while you cannot control everything outside you, wisdom still requires arranging what you can. That matters here. The Stoic is not a passive sufferer of preventable conditions. He's a steward. He understands that environment influences impressions. Impressions influence thought. Thought influences action, and repeated action becomes character. So if you care about character, you must eventually care about structure. A person who keeps saying he wants a different life while preserving the exact environment that feeds the old one is still negotiating with change. He may be sincere, but sincerity without structural adjustment often leads back to the same result. There is also a very compassionate side to this truth. Sometimes people think they are weak when they are simply overexposed to what weakens them. They think they lack discipline when their whole daily setting is designed to fracture discipline. They think they are broken when in reality they are under the influence of too much noise, too much access, too much stimulation, too much emotional contamination, too much disorder, too much availability to what keeps draining their spirit. Changing environment does not solve everything, but it can remove unnecessary suffering. It can give your better self a chance to breathe. It can reduce the constant war between intention and structure. It can allow the life you want to grow with less sabotage. So the 12th brutal truth is this: your environment is never just sitting there in the background. It is training you. It is either building your focus, your peace, your standards, your health, your seriousness, and your direction. Or it is slowly draining all of them while you call it normal. Once you see that clearly, you stop asking only, "What kind of person do I need to become?" and start asking a sharper question. What kind of world am I stepping into every day? And what is it doing to me? That question can change everything. Because the moment you stop underestimating environment, you stop fighting with one hand tied behind your back. You begin rebuilding not only your will, but the conditions around your will. And when those two finally start working together, life becomes less scattered, less exhausting, and far more capable of moving in the direction you know it should. The 13th truth: what you consume is shaping who you become. It is easy to think of consumption as something passive, almost innocent. You watch something to relax. You listen to something to fill the silence. You scroll for a few minutes to distract yourself. You absorb conversations, headlines, opinions, music, images, short clips, long arguments, random noise, and emotional atmospheres without always feeling that any of it matters very much. But this is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings a person can live with. What you repeatedly consume does not merely pass through you. It trains you. It instructs your attention. It shapes your desires. It alters your emotional baseline. It gives your mind a rhythm, a tone, a set of instincts, and eventually a kind of character. So if you are serious about rebuilding your life, you cannot keep acting as though your daily intake is separate from the person you are becoming. It is not separate at all. It is part of the construction. This truth is brutal because it removes yet another excuse. It means your mind is not only formed by the big decisions you make, but by the small things you repeatedly let inside. The video that flatters your weakness, the content that keeps you agitated, the conversation that leaves you more cynical than clear, the endless stream of images that trains you to compare, crave, envy, react, and fragment, the background noise that never lets the mind settle into itself, the low-quality input that seems harmless because it is everywhere. None of this stays neutral. Human beings absorb more than they realize. You become what you repeatedly feed, even when the feeding feels casual. The Stoics understood this in their own language. They were deeply concerned with impressions, what enters the mind, how it is interpreted, and what power it is allowed to gain. Epictetus was especially clear that not every impression deserves belief, attention, or obedience. That matters now more than ever, because modern life bombards the mind with impressions at a speed the soul was never meant to process without discipline. You are not just choosing entertainment, you are choosing mental furniture. You are choosing what kinds of voices will echo in your thinking later. You are choosing what your nervous system will begin to call familiar. And whatever becomes familiar begins, over time, to feel normal. That is why a person can sincerely want peace while constantly consuming agitation. He can want depth while consuming endless triviality. He can want discipline while feeding his mind with impulses that glorify comfort, distraction, and escape. Then he wonders why his inner life feels weak, noisy, and scattered. But the answer is not mysterious. He has been eating confusion and asking for clarity. He has been feeding restlessness and asking for calm. He has been consuming speed, outrage, vanity, comparison, and constant stimulation, then asking why silence feels uncomfortable and focused work feels unnatural. The mind reflects what it is trained on. It may not do so instantly, but it does so faithfully. Marcus Aurelius kept returning to the need to guard the inner citadel, not because he believed the world should be shut out entirely, but because he knew the mind becomes compromised when it carelessly lets everything enter. He understood that a human being must learn to distinguish between what nourishes and what contaminates. That distinction is not always dramatic. Some things do not poison you in an obvious way. They simply lower your seriousness little by little. They make you more reactive, less patient, less capable of stillness, less able to stay with demanding thoughts, less willing to endure the slow effort required for meaningful work. They reduce the soul's weight. And because this erosion happens gradually, people often do not notice it until they are living with a weaker mind than the one they once had. There is also an emotional dimension to consumption that many people ignore. What you consume does not only shape your thoughts, it shapes your emotional climate. If your daily intake is built around outrage, scandal, fear, lust, vanity, noise, and comparison, then your emotional world will begin mirroring those forces whether you intend it or not. You may become more anxious without knowing exactly why, more dissatisfied, more impatient, more mentally hungry and less spiritually nourished. The mind starts craving novelty while losing tolerance for reality in its natural pace. Then ordinary life begins to feel too quiet, too slow, too plain. Real conversation feels less stimulating. Deep work feels too demanding. Solitude feels empty. Silence feels threatening. That is not because life has become worse. It is because your consumption has retrained your baseline. Seneca warned that the soul takes on the color of its surroundings. That line is worth remembering here, because whatever repeatedly colors your inner world eventually begins coloring your identity. If you live inside cheap stimuli long enough, your standards become easier to cheapen. If you live inside shallow content long enough, your thinking becomes easier to flatten. If you consume constant emotional noise, your inner speech becomes louder and more unstable. And the reverse is also true. If you repeatedly feed the mind with what is strong, clean, disciplined, thoughtful, beautiful, and real, something inside you starts reorganizing itself around those qualities. Your taste changes. Your tolerance changes. Your instincts change. You become less available to nonsense because you have spent enough time feeding something better. This is why rebuilding your life is not only about what you stop doing, it is also about what you begin allowing into your mind with intention. You do not fix a starving soul by removing poison alone. You also have to offer nourishment. Better words, better silence, better music, better books, better conversations, better examples, better emotional atmospheres, better questions, better things to admire, better models of strength, better forms of beauty, better truths repeated often enough that they begin competing with the old mental noise. This is not about becoming rigid or joyless. It is about becoming selective. It is about understanding that the gate of the mind is too important to leave unguarded. And this is where the 13th brutal truth becomes very personal, because it forces you to ask what kind of person your daily intake is training you to be. Not the person you claim you want to become, the person your patterns are actually producing. Are you feeding courage or feeding avoidance? Are you feeding steadiness or feeding agitation? Are you feeding discipline or feeding appetite? Are you feeding depth or feeding endless stimulation? These questions matter because character is not built only in the moments when you are trying hard. It is also being built when you are just watching, just listening, just scrolling, just passing time. There is no just here. Repetition always leaves a mark. The hopeful part is that once you see this clearly, change becomes possible very quickly. Not easy, but clear. You begin treating consumption like training instead of background. You become more careful about what earns repeated access to your eyes, your ears, your imagination, your nervous system, your private mental space. You stop handing your inner world over to whatever is loudest, trendiest, or easiest. You begin choosing input that leaves you stronger after contact, not weaker. Calmer, not more fractured, more honest, not more numb, more awake, not more passive. That alone can begin changing the texture of your life, because once the quality of your input improves, the quality of your inner life often starts rising with it. So the 13th brutal truth is this: what you consume is shaping who you become, whether you mean for it to or not. It is training your mind, training your emotions, training your taste, training your standards, and quietly preparing the future version of you. Once you understand that, you stop asking only whether something is entertaining or convenient. You start asking whether it is worthy of building a mind you will have to live inside tomorrow. And that question, asked seriously enough, can save you from becoming someone formed by noise when you were meant to become someone formed by truth. The 14th truth: if you cannot handle boredom, you cannot build depth. One of the quietest signs that a life is being weakened is the inability to remain with anything long enough for depth to form. Not because the person lacks intelligence, not because he has no desire to grow, but because the mind has become so conditioned by stimulation that the moment reality slows down, restlessness takes over. This is why boredom matters more than most people realize. Boredom is not just an uncomfortable feeling. Very often it is the threshold between a shallow life and a deep one. If you cannot cross that threshold, if you keep escaping the moment things become quiet, repetitive, slow, or emotionally unstimulating, then you will struggle to build anything that requires patience, concentration, discipline, or inward seriousness. And almost everything meaningful requires exactly those things. This truth is brutal because modern life trains you to misread boredom. It teaches you to treat boredom as a problem that must be solved immediately, as if every empty moment were a threat. So the hand reaches for the phone, the ears reach for noise, the eyes search for something faster, brighter, easier, more emotionally charged. You do not even have to think about it anymore. The nervous system has learned the pattern. The moment stillness appears, escape follows. The moment effort becomes repetitive, distraction calls. The moment silence stretches a little too long, stimulation rushes in to fill it. And after enough repetition, the mind loses one of its most important capacities, the capacity to stay. That loss is more serious than it looks, because depth only appears after the early layer of restlessness. Real focus appears after the urge to abandon focus. Real reflection appears after the mind exhausts its first wave of noise. Real creativity often appears after the surface agitation has nowhere left to run. Real discipline grows when you stop demanding that meaningful work always feel exciting. But if you keep fleeing boredom, you never reach any of that. You remain trapped at the surface of experience, always in motion, always stimulated, always occupied, yet rarely transformed. The tragedy is not that you are inactive. The tragedy is that you are active in ways that keep preventing depth from ever arriving. The Stoics understood the value of remaining with what is plain, slow, and unadorned. Marcus Aurelius did not train himself through constant novelty. He trained himself through repetition, reflection, restraint, and returning again and again to what was essential. He knew that a serious soul is not built by chasing stimulation. It is built by strengthening the ability to remain present without needing every moment to entertain it. This is one reason Stoic discipline still feels difficult today. It asks you to endure not only pain, but plainness, not only hardship, but slowness, not only suffering, but the ordinary repetition through which character is actually formed. And maybe that is the harder challenge for many people now. Pain, strangely enough, can feel dramatic. It can make you feel alive, but boredom feels empty. It feels unimpressive. It feels like nothing is happening. Yet that is often the exact space where something important is trying to begin. When you sit in silence long enough, uncomfortable truths start surfacing. When you stay with focused work long enough, the scattered mind begins settling into one direction. When you repeat the same good habits long enough, they stop feeling glamorous and start becoming identity. When you live without constant stimulation long enough, your attention begins recovering its natural strength. But none of this can happen if boredom always wins the argument. Seneca would likely say that the soul becomes enslaved not only by pain or luxury, but by dependency, and dependency on stimulation is one of the most underestimated forms of slavery. If you need constant novelty to remain engaged with your own life, then your inner life is no longer free. It is being controlled by external intensity. The simple task feels unbearable. The quiet room feels oppressive. The slow book feels exhausting. The gradual process feels intolerable. But that intolerance is not proof that depth is impossible. It is proof that the mind has been overtrained in quick reward and undertrained in serious attention. That can be changed, but only if you stop obeying boredom like it has authority. There is a hidden moral lesson here too. A person who cannot tolerate boredom often becomes vulnerable to every low-quality impulse that promises relief. Cheap pleasure, unnecessary noise, random scrolling, shallow conversations, emotional drama, endless consumption, all of them start looking attractive not because they are meaningful, but because they rescue the mind from having to remain with what feels empty. Yet much of life's real value is found by staying through that emptiness. The first 20 minutes of focused work may feel dry. The early days of discipline may feel flat. Solitude may feel uncomfortable before it becomes clarifying. Silence may feel heavy before it becomes peaceful. Exercise may feel repetitive before it becomes identity. Prayer, study, writing, healing, creating, rebuilding. All of these ask you to pass through a zone where the mind is tempted to say, "This is boring. Leave now." Epictetus would likely remind you that freedom lies in governing your responses rather than surrendering to every impression. Boredom is one of those impressions. It arrives and says, "This moment has no value. Escape it." But impressions are not commands. They are tests. And when you begin treating boredom as a test instead of a verdict, something changes. You realize that boredom may simply be the feeling of your nervous system not getting what it has become used to. It is not always a sign that something is wrong. Often it is a sign that something real is beginning, something slower, cleaner, deeper, something that does not flatter your impulses but may actually rebuild your mind. This is why the ability to handle boredom is almost a forgotten form of strength. It allows you to read beyond the first page of restlessness. It allows you to work beyond the first wave of resistance. It allows you to sit with yourself long enough to hear what constant stimulation keeps drowning out. It allows you to train attention, patience, steadiness, and seriousness, all the qualities that a strong life is built on. Without that capacity, life becomes a sequence of reactions to whatever feels immediately rewarding. With it, a person gains access to a very different kind of existence, one where inner force is not constantly leaking into the search for the next hit of stimulation. And once you start seeing boredom differently, you stop fearing it so much. You begin using it. You understand that boredom is often the doorway to discipline, and discipline is the doorway to freedom. You see that the mind becomes deeper, not by being endlessly entertained, but by being trained to remain present when entertainment is absent. That is when books begin opening in a different way. That is when work begins acquiring weight. That is when silence becomes fertile instead of frightening. That is when the soul stops needing constant external movement just to avoid collapsing into itself. So the 14th brutal truth is this: if you cannot handle boredom, you cannot build depth. Not because depth is reserved for a special kind of person, but because depth always asks you to stay longer than the distracted mind wants to stay. It asks you to endure the flat beginning, the repetitive middle, the slow unfolding that makes no promises of instant emotional reward. And if you keep escaping that zone, you will keep escaping the very conditions in which your stronger self could have been formed. But the moment you stop running from boredom, life begins changing in a quiet and powerful way. Your attention strengthens, your mind becomes less needy. Your habits become more stable, your work becomes deeper, your peace becomes less dependent on constant stimulation. And slowly, almost without noticing it at first, you begin becoming someone who no longer needs life to be loud in order to live it fully. That is when depth begins. That is when the inner architecture of a meaningful life starts taking shape. The 15th truth: death is the reminder that makes life urgent. There is a truth most people try not to touch too directly, not because they do not know it, but because they know it too well. You are going to die. Everyone around you is going to die. Every habit, every delay, every excuse, every wasted season, every unresolved truth, every unlived part of your potential exists under that fact. And this is exactly why the Stoics returned to death so often. Not because they were dark, hopeless, or obsessed with suffering, but because they understood something that comfort-driven minds keep trying to avoid. When death disappears from awareness, life becomes vague. Standards soften. Delay becomes easier. Distraction becomes more seductive. Petty things gain too much importance. The day starts feeling disposable. But when death returns to the mind in the right way, life becomes sharper, cleaner, and more honest. Memento mori does not make life smaller. It makes it serious. This is the 15th brutal truth because it tears away the most comforting illusion of all, the illusion that there is always more time to begin, more time to heal, more time to say what must be said, remove what must be removed, build what must be built, become who you know you are meant to become. The mind loves this illusion because it protects you from urgency. It allows you to treat today as if it were replaceable. It lets you postpone your own life with very little emotional resistance. But death stands over all of that like a final correction. It says, no, this day is not endlessly repeatable. This year is not guaranteed. This body will not last forever. These people will not remain beside you forever. This chance to become honest, disciplined, courageous, and awake is happening inside a limited frame. And because it is limited, it matters. Marcus Aurelius returned to this thought constantly, not in a theatrical way, but in a practical one. He used death to cut through vanity, laziness, resentment, and distraction. He knew that remembering mortality helps you stop behaving as though your life were an abstract idea. It brings everything back to proportion. Suddenly, the argument you have been rehearsing for weeks looks smaller. The need for approval loses some of its power. The delay you called harmless begins to look expensive. The habits that seemed minor reveal themselves as part of a finite life being shaped in real time. Death removes the fantasy that you can drift forever and still arrive somewhere meaningful. And this is why memento mori is not morbid when understood properly. It is medicinal. It restores seriousness to a life that has been diluted by endless postponement. It reminds you that one day all the emotional bargains you made with weakness will be over, and what will remain is the life those bargains created. That is a hard thing to sit with, but it is also a profoundly liberating thing to sit with. Because once you truly remember that time is limited, you stop waiting for every decision to feel emotionally convenient. You stop asking whether discipline feels pleasant. You stop treating your attention like something cheap. You stop offering your energy so carelessly to things that do not deserve a place in your remaining years. Death, when remembered wisely, becomes a purifier. It burns away the false importance of trivial things. Seneca wrote with piercing clarity about this. He said, "We are not given a short life, but we make it short by wasting much of it." That line lands differently when you place it beside mortality, because the problem is not only that life ends. The problem is that much of it can disappear before we truly begin inhabiting it. A person can be alive for decades and still not have really lived with intention. He can postpone his own soul year after year, keeping himself busy, entertained, reactive, and half-committed until one day the truth becomes unavoidable. It is later than he thought. That is what memento mori interrupts. It refuses to let you remain unconscious for too long. It asks, if you knew more clearly that your time is running, what would you stop tolerating? What would you stop delaying? What would suddenly become too sacred to waste? And notice how different your life looks when those questions are allowed to become real. The endless scrolling becomes harder to justify. The weak standards become harder to defend. The emotional dependence, the constant distraction, the shallow routines, the draining relationships, the half-lived ambitions, the repeated private compromises, all of it starts feeling heavier under the light of mortality. Not because death makes life hopeless, but because death reveals value. It shows you that a day is not just a day, it is a portion of your life, and your life is not infinite. The person who forgets this spends time casually. The person who remembers it begins spending time morally, carefully, deliberately, with reverence. Epictetus would likely remind you that death itself is not the evil. The real danger is living in fear, illusion, and misalignment before death arrives. That is a powerful shift. The purpose of remembering death is not to become anxious about the future. It is to become honest about the present. It is to ask whether the way you are living now would make sense if you fully accepted how temporary everything is. Would this resentment still be worth carrying? Would this comfort still be worth obeying? Would this habit still be worth defending? Would this delay still seem reasonable? Very often the answer becomes clear very quickly. Mortality simplifies. It takes the tangled mental noise of modern life and cuts through it with one severe question. Given that this ends, what actually deserves your life? That question does not always produce dramatic answers. Sometimes it produces small but life-changing ones. Call the person, end the habit, protect the morning, build the routine, tell the truth, stop negotiating with what weakens you. Return to your work. Return to your body. Return to your principles. Return to the part of you that already knows what matters. Death does not only ask for grand heroism. Often it asks for immediate honesty. It asks you to stop living as if the meaningful version of your life will begin somewhere later, after enough delays have been granted. It reminds you that later is a dangerous fantasy when used as a hiding place from change. There is also a strange peace that comes from this remembrance. Once you accept mortality more fully, you become less shocked by the pressure to live well. You understand that urgency is not cruelty. It is reality. It is not harsh that time is limited. It is clarifying. It is what gives weight to love, work, discipline, friendship, solitude, beauty, effort, and truth. Without an end, nothing would press itself upon your conscience with such seriousness. Death gives life edges, and those edges are what make responsibility meaningful. They are what make your choices matter. They are what make this very day worthy of protection. So the 15th brutal truth is this: death is not only the end of life. It is the reminder that saves life from being wasted before the end arrives. Memento mori brings urgency back to a distracted mind. It humbles vanity. It strips excuses of their elegance. It forces you to see time not as a vague resource, but as something sacred because it runs out. And once you truly allow that truth to enter your bones, you begin changing in ways that are difficult to fake. Your standards rise. Your attention becomes more guarded. Your decisions become cleaner. Your days become less casual. You begin treating your life as something happening now, not later. That is the final brutal truth. Death is the reminder that makes life urgent. And if you remember it the Stoic way, not with fear, but with clarity, then it will not make you despair. It will make you wake up. It will make you stop waiting. It will make you stop wasting the very thing you keep assuming you have more of. And from that awakening, a stronger life can finally begin. Not someday, but while there is still time. So if there is one thing I want to leave with you, it is this: your life is not rebuilt in one dramatic moment. It is rebuilt the day you stop lying to yourself about what is costing you your future. It is rebuilt when you stop calling delay preparation, stop calling distraction rest, stop calling fear being realistic, and stop calling a weak pattern just who I am. That is where real change begins, not in motivation, not in fantasy, but in honesty, strong enough to create action. The Stoics never promised an easy life. They promised a clear one, a life where you stop wasting energy fighting reality and start using your days with purpose. A life where your standards are no longer negotiable, your attention is no longer cheap, and your time is no longer treated like something endless, because it is not endless. And maybe that is not a tragedy, maybe that is the gift. Maybe the fact that life is limited is exactly what gives it weight, dignity, and urgency. So take these truths seriously, not as ideas to admire for one evening, but as mirrors. Ask yourself which one exposes the place where your life has been leaking most. Which truth names the habit, the excuse, the delay, the environment, the distraction, or the fear that has been quietly keeping you from becoming who you know you could be. Start there. Not everywhere. Just there. One honest correction can begin changing the structure of an entire life. And if this episode spoke to something real in you, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with the brutal truth that hit you the hardest, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because a wasted life is rarely lost all at once, and a meaningful life is rebuilt the same way, one serious decision at a time.